Big Conversations, Little Bar, with your hosts Randy Florence and Patrick Evans, featuring candid conversations with the Coachella Valley's most interesting and influential people. Pull up a bar stool and enjoy Big Conversations, Little Bar.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Big Conversations, Little Bar. I'm Patrick Evans, along with Mr. Randy Florence.
Your sidekick, and I'm happy to be here again. Who am I today?
You say that like it's a bad thing, but I want to remind you that after Johnny Carson retired, Ed McMahon went on to a long and illustrious career on Star Search. So
I'm going to start a Star Search.
If you are the Ed McMahon, I'm not saying you are. I mean, I say that to other people, but I wouldn't say it to you. If you are the Ed McMahon of this podcast, that's a good thing.
I'm really more of a Tommy Newsom. Kind of guy. I've got that kind of personality.
Doc is not here. Yeah. Tommy Newsom's with the band.
So I want to introduce our guest who probably has no clue what any of those names that we just mentioned, who they are or what they mean.
You ever heard of? You introduce him, then we'll quiz him. Go ahead.
I do want to introduce everybody today to our guest, Brian Blueskye from the Desert Sun. Brian, thanks for being on here.
Thank you for having me.
Brian and I have known each other for a few years, and we met the first time at a session of the storytellers for the Desert Sun, where we got up and talked about our story. Everything I know about Brian, I learned from that video. So if I end up repeating a bunch of stuff, I apologize.
Oh, no worries.
Brian, you joined the Desert Sun immediately following, within 2 weeks of the departure of Bruce Fessier, well, I think Bruce would be pretty honest about the fact that you followed a legend.
Oh, yeah.
An institution, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
A household name.
I think he's a fixture at the Desert Sun still.
He hasn't figured out not to show up every day again?
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, we'll get into your background a little bit, but you followed somebody who from day one had written about culture and entertainment in this market, and one day you're taking over for him. What was that like?
Yeah, I didn't know that he was retiring. It wasn't really kept private. It was out there for a while. And when I talked to him, I think it was right after the Desert Sun formally announced that he was leaving. And then he was putting up social media posts. I went to go interview him for CV Independent. And when I was interviewing him for CV Independent, I asked him, I said, "Who's replacing you?" And he said, no one. Do you want the job? And I'm like, yeah, I want the job. And
that was pretty fortuitous.
Yeah. I mean, he got to handpick his successor. A couple people kind of mentioned that to me. It's like, wow, it's like Bruce got to pick his successor, and I'm proud to be his successor.
Wow. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. So how long were you working with the CV Independent before stepping aboard the Desert Sun?
I want to say it was about 6 years, 6 or 7 years.
Okay, so that's a good long run. You got to know the Valley pretty well.
Yeah, that's another interesting story. When I joined CV Independent, they had just put out the first print issue, and I had no idea what I was going to do there. Jimmy hired me to do a couple articles, and then 2 weeks after I turned in my first one, he's sending me to Coachella because the writer that he was bringing in from Tucson didn't show up. So I went to my first Coachella while working at CV Independent, and I had no idea what I was getting into. And I walked on the site for the first time, and, I'd been to Stagecoach before. And seeing Coachella after watching it on the live stream for so many years and stepping onto that property with all the people there in the 5 o'clock hour when you just stand somewhere and you watch the crossfade of the crowds when one stage ends and another stage ends and they're all just walking like that every year I kind of find a spot around that time when the sun's going down and watch the crowd just kind of cross into each other.
You kind of established a method of covering Coachella your very first time that they hadn't seen before. It was like you were everywhere all at once.
Right, and that was kind of a challenge because I would run from one stage to another. I would just take a schedule and be like, okay, well, that one ends at 5:35, so I can definitely go to this one and run over there. But that first year was so crazy, just running back and forth between stages.
Well, plus they're always on schedule. They never run late, so that's
yeah. We'll talk about Frank Ocean later. So this week, the weekend, first weekend of Coachella, you're covering it.
Mm-hmm.
This has got to feel a long way away from a cubicle at a bank calling center.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of your first job, right?
Well, it was one of my many jobs, and that was in Cleveland, Ohio. And I really wanted to stay at that job because it paid well. We got bonuses, and I lived in a luxury apartment building in Ohio with a friend and a couple more friends, and it was fun. But, when they announced that you have 1 year to figure out what you're going to do because we're going to lay you off, it's like, well, I'm going to California. And I was a little sad and bitter about leaving Cleveland, but it was time to go because there was just nothing left there. And I had to get out. I knew that I was going to have to get out. But
a lot of people are sad and bitter about having to go to Cleveland.
Yeah.
His was the opposite situation, yeah.
But I kind of thought I would go to Detroit. I was going back and forth to Detroit here and there on the weekends.
But you grew up in Ohio, so
yeah.
That was your wheelhouse, the Midwest, those areas. So
yeah, and as I've gotten older, I kind of miss the Midwest, but not really.
You've gotten old enough where the memories are good.
The memories are good. The lifestyle's good, but I just don't want the weather, and I just don't want to be there.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, when I came to California, it was like, okay, well, I'm kind of bitter and mad about having to leave Cleveland under the circumstance, but I was in California. I mean, it was kind of a dream come true. And I thought, okay, I'll work part-time, and I kind of went through the motions for a little while. I worked in retail here. And then when the CV Independent opportunity came up, I mean, I've been busy ever since. It's like I've never stopped.
So growing up, was writing and music something that you were always interested in? Was there ever a dream that this is the direction my career is going to head?
Well, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of magazines about music. I went to concerts a lot. But, my grandfather was a retired physician and was always concerned about how are you going to make a living? I mean, I was not really a good student, and, I had certain talents that my grandfather saw as that's not going to get you anywhere. And he would always ask me, why do you write in a notebook all the time? And I was like, it's poetry. And it's like, that's nonsense. And people would tell me, like, you can't make money as a poet. And I'm like, I'm not trying to make money as a poet. This is just something that I'm
about.
Yeah, so
I don't think anybody tries to make money as a poet.
No
one goes into poetry thinking this is the cash cow.
Exactly. And even if you're a rich poet, you're behind on your rent. I mean, just take a look at some of the famous ones in recent times. You read about certain poets.
There's a lot of suicides.
Yeah. Yes. Evictions or poverty or something like that.
That's the quote of the podcast, I think, for all time thus far. Even if you're a rich poet, you're behind on your rent.
Damn, that was my dream, too.
That is poetry in and of itself.
Should
Brian.
I say
like
a
that.
famous poet, you're behind on your rent? Maybe rich poet is like, here, we gave you $20,000 as an advance. Don't spend it all in one spot.
Don't squander it.
So you like to write?
Yeah.
Yeah, but did you know why, or was it
Did
just...
you write for the school newspaper? Or
No.
So when you were hired at the CV Independent, that was your first legit writing gig?
Yeah, and zines were kind of an interest too because I went to school with this guy named Joe Beal, or he lived in my hometown. He was a little bit older than me. And Joe was really famous for being the guy that showed up at certain things and, underground events, and he would bring a box with him, and it was zines. And I'd never even seen a zine or knew what it was, and he sold me my first ever zine.
So describe that.
A zine is an independent kind of newsletter thing. People
short for magazine. That's where they got it from, Randy.
I always called them mags. Sorry.
It's kind of an underground newsletter in a way. There's all kinds of different ones. People draw things inside of them. They'll put in their own photos. They'll make collages in them. And, some of them are artistic. Some of them are political. Some of them are promoting a certain underground lifestyle. In my case, I had no idea what I was buying, and just when I went through it, I'm like, what am I reading?
What did you get?
It was just like a mishmash of all this, political stuff, riding bikes, being a vegan, all this other... And
it was like the original Mother Earth magazine.
Yeah.
Really subversive stuff, vegan.
And they're traded underground. And, these people will send them to people that's, it's either they're traded or they're accumulated by people that sell them. And you buy them and you read them, and it's just like, what is this? This is so weird. And, I had no idea what I was buying.
This is like the original NFTs.
Yeah.
Just trading them, huh?
Yeah. But Joe went on to form Microcosm Publishing in Portland, Oregon. And he's one of the top independent publishing people for books. And some of the books that he's published are pretty profound. So Joe was kind of my intro into zines, and I didn't know that you could actually do something like that. And I did write for a Zen Buddhist zine that was being sent to prisons. I did an interview for one.
We have a captive audience.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. But yeah, that was kind of but ever since that one time, I think it was the early 2000s, I'd never written a news piece or anything like that. And the first news piece that I wrote for CV Independent was on Alex Harrington, who at the time was not a well-known DJ in the local area, but has now become the resident DJ at one of the hotels in Palm Springs and has a pretty good following locally. And Alex and I have known each other for going on 20 years now. I mean, I've known that guy for a long time. Wow. So, and I knew that he was doing it, and he was kind of transitioning from certain interests, but, I knew that he was a musician. I used to work with him at Borders Books and Music. And then when I heard he was a DJ, I'm like, oh, I got to hear the story behind this. And I knew he was taking it seriously, because when I had sort of reconnected with him, he was telling me about, I'm doing this, and, I'm having trouble trying to find gigs, but I'm putting up these videos of me making music. And when I saw him doing it, I was like, that's kind of a profound story. And when Jimmy gave me the opportunity to find me a story, that was the first thing that I thought of was Alex. So, and I knew it would be a good one.
And for our listeners, for the listener, Jimmy Bogle, the publisher of CV Independent,
Jimmy Bogle from CV Independent. I think he'd
referencing.
He'd be a little upset if I didn't mention his full name.
I'm sure he's listening right now.
He probably is.
What did you listen to growing up?
I started out with rock and roll. I wanted a Metallica album for Christmas. I've told this story a few times. I wanted a Metallica album in 5th grade. My mom got me Huey Lewis and the News.
Oh.
And
very similar. I mean, really cut from the same cloth.
And when my mom said,
Metallica did a cover version of Hip to Be Square.
No, they did a cover version of It Don't Take Money to Ride This Train. Power of Love. It's a different version than the one in the movie. Back to the Future. It's a little different.
The album was Sports.
Yes.
And she was like,
one of the top selling albums of all time.
Of course, but it's not my bag and never has been. And I actually chucked that CD at a wall one time when I got really upset and watched it shatter, and I felt so good about it.
Did you keep the album cover?
No.
Everything went.
The jewel case, once you check the CD, there's no use to having it. All right, so then you must be excited about Power Trip.
Oh, yeah. But going back, I didn't get my first actual CDs that I wanted with my own money till I was about 13 or 14. And I liked Aerosmith. I liked Metallica. I finally bought that Black album I always wanted. 9 Inch Nails. I mean, I was kind of all over the place.
What was your first live concert?
My first live concert was Aerosmith.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty cool story.
1994 in what is now the Quicken Loans Arena in Cleveland.
By the way, this is our first guest on the podcast that when talking about the music that he grew up with, wasn't talking about vinyl. He was talking about CDs.
Well,
good point.
Vinyl was still around. I mean, it was kind of making a comeback, but I kind of thought, who still has a record player?
Right.
And there weren't a lot of record players for sale at that time. You had to go to Best Buy and go in the back corner and find one. And it was probably about $200 or $300. And, I think my aunt had one, and it was an older one.
Well, we've stepped up because our last 3 guests, we were all talking about 8-tracks. So this is definitely a move up.
But you could buy albums on vinyl, but if you wanted to do a turntable, you're either a techno DJ or you were a serious music lover. Unlike now, turntables are for sale at Target for $75, and vinyls are at Barnes & Noble.
Right, but vinyls are expensive now.
They're expensive, but you have to think about how expensive they are to produce now because they just don't have the equipment to mass produce them. So, yeah, vinyl's one of those things that if I buy one, it's got to be something I really want, have heard already, and it's an experience, not just putting it on for a couple songs.
See, now I want to go over to your house and scratch a record just to...
Oh, come over to my house. I got a bunch of scratch records. Every one of them is a scratch record. Yeah.
So, obviously, having that kind of musical background and loving that stuff, like when you walked onto the site for Coachella the very first time, I mean, here you are in this incredible... You must have been pinching yourself.
Yeah. And
Who was the first headliner that first show?
Blur. I went the second weekend when Blur got switched from Stone Roses. And then I'm trying to think who the Saturday headliner was Phoenix. And the Sunday headliner was Red Hot Chili Peppers, who I've seen many times. And the Sunday night slot at any music festival is now called the Chili Peppers slot.
Really?
It's like the old Reliable. You put that on, and maybe some people stay, but, Trent Reznor once said that, he didn't want the dreaded Sunday Chili Peppers slot. Because
that's a thing now?
Yeah. It put the Chili Peppers in on a Sunday at a festival, and, yeah, it's either half the crowd's going to go home or half are going to stay.
So, as you're walking through the grounds at Coachella, is there ever that part of the young Brian Blueskye that just cannot believe where you are?
Yeah.
What's happened to you?
So many people that I have always wanted to see. Jello Biafra, Dead Kennedys was there that year. Lee Scratch Perry. I mean, all my musical interests were there at one spot through a weekend. Many of them that I had wanted to see. And I remember watching Lee Scratch Perry, who was like a well-known reggae producer that just did weird reggae. I mean, later on, he was combining dubstep and all this other stuff into his sound. And if you go back and you listen to Lee Scratch Perry, it's kind of like punk rock reggae. I mean, he would just kind of... he wouldn't really sing sometimes. It was just like he would yell and chant. And
That's quite a mix of two genres there, yeah.
But then he would do these really amazing reggae songs. I mean, he was just all over the map. And that time he was doing the dubstep combined with reggae. And I was just watching these people watch, and just when he would drop certain beats, or the DJ would drop the certain beats, and you would watch the crowd, it's like, this is unbelievable. This is the stuff I wanted to see years ago when I first heard it.
Yeah.
And watching Jello Biafra from Dead Kennedys do his own music, and he changed the lyrics to California Uber Alice, which I thought was really strange. I think he changed it to like Schwarzenegger was governor or something like that, or I forget who the political figure was that he put in there. And then, Moby, I've always wanted to see Moby. He didn't ever really come to Cleveland, and he did a DJ set that weekend that was phenomenal. When I stepped into the Sahara tent for the first time, I just looked around like, I can't believe the level of production in here. This is insane.
The Sahara tent has almost turned into like a main stage itself, hasn't it?
Oh, it's been a main stage for years.
For a while.
And the fact it's gotten bigger, and it still draws a huge crowd to where you can barely get in there, it says something. But the music in there has evolved too. It's not just EDM and DJs, it's rap music. And then this past weekend, Blink-182 played in there, which was the first that I've ever seen on that stage. Watching them pull the DJ booth back so they could put Travis Barker's drums up. I mean, that you don't see that on that stage. That DJ booth just kind of stays there.
Had you ever seen Blink before?
Yeah, I saw him in 1998, and I think Travis Barker had just joined the band. I didn't really pay attention to who was playing drums because you never really pay attention to the
He
drummer.
hadn't started turning upside down on the stage yet. Huh?
Yeah, and then I saw him in 2000 when Bad Religion went on tour with him. And I only just went to go see Bad Religion, but my friend really was trying to coax me into staying, so he disappeared for that. And then he reappeared when Blink-182 was over. And I'm like, where did you go? Oh, I got lost. I'm like, no, you didn't. You coaxed me into staying here, knowing that I should have left him there.
I saw Blink-182, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago with Green Day. My sons and I were sitting on the lawn at a place called Shoreline Amphitheater up in the Bay Area, and it was really just a big weed fest on the lawn. And it was really kind of scary because at that point, Shoreline had issues where there was gas coming out of the lawn, and sometimes it would burst into flames. So you had to be careful with that. But
Now, that sounds like a fun music
It was
festival.
awesome. Well,
That-
if you were high enough, bursting flames next to you didn't really cause a major issue. The happiest person that day was the person who came out, the Kit Kat vendor, about halfway through, started walking through the lawn, and he could sell a Kit Kat for about $50 by that time because people were looking for anything. So that's my story about Blink-182.
Sounds about right.
You remember the whole set.
No, I remembered up until we got the Kit Kat.
You
bars,
remembered
and
you remembered that they played.
pretty much blanked out from that point on.
It sounded like the same set, like the set that I saw this weekend, give or take a few of the songs that came afterward, sounded exactly almost like when I saw them in 2000. I mean, the stuff from Take Off Your Pants and Jacket and some of the other things. I mean, I remember the Dude Ranch and Enema of the State, and it was a heavy Enema of the State set. Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit
It's a
about...
phrase you don't hear very often.
No,
Yeah.
twice here. Talk to us a little bit about stories from Coachella, not just as a reporter, but just as an attendee at Coachella. Just some of the kind of crazy things you've remembered, or things that really stand out as these are the stories I want to tell about Coachella.
Well, I mean, I've met a lot of people from different parts of the world. I remember the first year when Blur was playing, I was standing somewhere and I met this guy from, I think it was Scotland or the UK, one of the two. Maybe Wales, I'm not sure where. But he had this very familiar looking face, like you would never forget it. And he was talking to me, and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to watch Blur later." And he had nothing nice to say about Damon Albarn. Like, he kind of threw in some British cuss words, and you know, I was like, "Okay, well, you're obviously not a fan." And he said, "You need to watch the Stone Roses." And I said, "Well, you know, not really. I know one song." And I'm like, "Okay, maybe I will." And I did watch a few songs that night, but it just didn't grab me. But I think it was 3 or 4 years later, I watched the documentary on the Stone Roses, and they showed that guy waiting in line for the first gig when they had played again. So he must have flown to the U.S. just to watch the Stone Roses that night at Coachella.
Wow. So he was like one of those people that follow fish around the world
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah, and I remember, you know, I'm trying to like really remember. I mean, I remember Mini-Me, Vern Troyer. I swear
He
it was,
almost ran you over, didn't he?
yeah, I swear it was him. I mean, if so, I mean, I don't think there's two Vern Troyers in the world, but he was this little guy on a hover-round, bald. It was definitely him, and he was honking the horn and screamed at me to get out of his way, and I swear I heard that high-pitched voice. I'm like, is that Mini-Me? And he's driving around, he's still honking the horn, yelling at people, like, move out of the way. And
And he probably wasn't even the oddest character that you've ever seen there.
no. I mean, you see all kinds of weird characters, and, you know, some of the things that I've seen, too, are not appropriate for the podcast.
Oh,
But-
nothing's too inappropriate for this podcast.
Well,
Yeah.
after the murder penguin story.
after the murder penguin story,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Well, I'd rather not tell certain stories of what I've seen, but I
All right,
remember...
kill the
Keep you
mics, 'cause-
awake.
Kill the mics, John. I want to hear these stories. These are the stories I want to hear. This is
We're going to take a short break.
That's right. There will be dead air for about 3 minutes, but it'll be...
Maybe some other time. But I remember seeing one specific thing, and this lady was standing next to me, like, did you just see that? And I said, yeah. And she said, I can't believe that happened. That's so gross. And I'm like, uh-huh.
No.
Yeah, you can kind of get an idea of where it's going
Yeah,
there.
we'll leave that. So do you ever get awestruck by any of the people that you see at Coachella? Obviously, there's a lot of people there that are just there to be seen.
I think the one year I was awestruck was when I watched Beyonce.
Really?
That was the greatest set that I've ever seen at a Coachella. And I think it kind of took a lot to get me to a place to appreciate pop music, you know, especially since
How come?
I always saw it as like, oh, it's happy, mainstream, money-making, tons of producers, overproduced, don't write their own songs, don't really, and Beyonce... before that, I had gotten to the point where I started to appreciate pop music. Some of the presentations of it, And it does have its place in culture. I mean, there's something to appreciate about music that makes you feel good, but you're not disconnected from reality. And I think I had to learn how to embrace music about it's okay to be happy versus being angry all the time. And I think and Katy Perry was one of those people that kind of did that for me. Other people too, like even old crooner stuff that my grandparents listened to. I love that stuff. And watching Beyonce, it really opened my mind up to what pop music is. And I've come to appreciate it more now. And Beyonce's performance, it totally obliterated
It kind of changed live music a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, watching the presentation of it, the dancing, the fact that her dancers never once stepped in front of her, and you could feel her voice coming out. I mean, she was singing. You could tell she was singing. There were some imperfections that came out that I noticed, but she was belting it. And I've never seen any performance on that scale. And that is my favorite Coachella memory, was watching Beyonce.
Wow. That's a great story.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Who have you seen at Coachella that you would have paid to see?
Many people.
Tell us about it.
Well, I would have paid to see Moby for sure if he ever came to Cleveland, but he never did. I'm trying to think. I'd pay to see Death Grips. I remember when Death Grips played the one year. They're this really obnoxious sort of punk rock rap duo. I'm trying to think of some. Blur I would have definitely paid to see. I'd always wanted to see Blur, so when I finally got to see him, it was kind of a reward in a way. And I told Jimmy the next morning, it does not feel like work to watch Blur. Wow. And it was fun to watch him.
And then Jimmy didn't pay him, so it wasn't work.
Jimmy
Jimmy wouldn't do that. I'm kidding. We love Jimmy. What about this year's lineup? And you were just talking about pop music and feel-good pop music, and like a Bad Bunny.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into your worldview of music?
Well, the one thing that I notice every year, and Bruce sort of spoke of this before he left, more international music is starting to come into the U.S. now. And when I look at the Coachella lineup, it kind of speaks as to how fast our world became interconnected. Because kids are listening to Latin music in parts of the world that I never would have imagined, or parts of the U.S., I should say, that I never would have thought. Because some of these Norteno bands that I've interviewed have said, like, we're playing states that we never even went to, and it's like white people know the words. They're kind of surprised, like they're learning Spanish to sing. Yep. Either that or, like, their friends have turned them on to it, and they just want to go experience it. And Bad Bunny, for instance, that whole Puerto Rican thing, and then J Balvin with how big he got. And Bad Bunny and J Balvin were kind of intertwining with, like, Beyonce and all these, Jennifer Lopez, and they had their mainstream moments. So to see how interconnected our world has become musically and culturally, the Coachella lineup reflects that.
Yeah.
We had the first Palestinian Chilean singer. I forget who that was, but no one was expecting that at the Desert Sun. I mean, someone went to see it and was like, this is incredible. I forget who wrote. I think it was Paul. But just reading that review, I was like, wow. There were so many over the weekend, and we try to find those really diverse artists. And I remember last year watching Stromae, and Stromae had sold out Madison Square Garden. And I remember reading that in a New York Times article before Coachella. And when I watched him at Coachella and the way that people were responding to him, it's like, I get it. Our world's becoming more interconnected now.
Well, there aren't many bigger international artists than Blackpink.
Yeah.
Right?
And
how was that show?
Oh, I didn't know what to expect covering a K-pop group. And Nikki Kottman, my editor, she told me a little while before, just remember that USA Today is going to put your coverage out there, and this is a K-pop band. No pressure or anything. And I was just like, thanks. And when I was walking to go watch them, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, don't K-pop fans have like a mafia that attacks you and trolls you online? And, I've been reading about that.
That's Britney Spears.
Oh, K-pop fans are,
yes.
I get it. They're passionate about what they love. But when I watched Blackpink, it was incredible. It was not as good as Beyonce, but it's up there for me.
Do you think with the K-pop music in particular, do you think that there's an international impact that's coming into American music where more young people are willing to accept bands from outside of the United States? I know the Latin music's always been big, and it's becoming even bigger in this area now, particularly.
Everybody
with
was
the
really
arena.
mad about when those British bands came over.
Yeah,
we didn't really accept that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's. But is this becoming? I mean, how many bands at Coachella were non-English speaking bands this year? There's quite a few of them.
Quite a few, but the one thing to remember about K-pop, they're singing in English in in the Korean language.
Right.
They usually have a sound that combines electronic music, hip-hop, rock music. They know how to mix it. They've created this brand. Each band, they have like a brand that is sort of all flavors.
And it's not just young women listening to their music.
No. And it's not just like Asian Americans. And, I saw tons of American kids walking around with Blackpink t-shirts. Yeah. And there was this guy carrying this thing, and it was a pink heart that lit up, and he was sitting there waving it around. And, that has a huge following. And when you see the countries that these K-pop groups are going to, it's kind of an international thing now.
Yeah.
And, of course, Blackpink, when they were performing, they said, hello, Coachella, and then they said it again in South Korean. The Korean language. I keep thinking there's no difference between, there's a major difference between the two countries, but not the language. But hearing them say
one thing they have in common.
Yeah. But hearing them say hello, Coachella in Korean and, and then in English, and there were people that responded to both. And I heard that through the crowd, and I just said, I see what Bruce was saying about them singing in English and Korean and how that's appealing to people.
Since you took the job at the Sun, we've got an arena that has been built here. Some fantastic acts, and as we just saw earlier, they're bringing in more of the large Latin acts too, so they clearly know what their audience here is in the area. But what do you see the general trend of music in Coachella Valley moving to, and do you see the arena playing a role in bringing more types of music in?
Well, I think it's great for national touring acts that we have an arena, and I think that's great for the audience. But one of the things I'm really concerned about, the local bands, especially since the end of the pandemic, there's nowhere really for them to play. And some of these opportunities that they used to have are gone.
What?
Well, there used to be more venues. In 2013, 2014, when I first started going to cover local music, you had the Hood Bar and Pizza, and Brandon Henderson, who was the promoter at the time, was booking, these little punk rock acts that everyone remembers from the 90s, and, even stuff that's kind of relevant today. I mean, he brought a lot of that stuff, but he would put local talent on the same bill. I remember when Jello Biafra played the Hood, and he had all these local bands playing behind Jello Biafra. And I'm sure for all those local bands, that had to have been an incredible experience. Yeah. And they would feature these bands, regularly. But lately, since the pandemic eased, I don't see a lot of shows coming at the Hood. I don't know what's going on. I would like to know. And then, we had this new venue open up in Palm Springs called Alibi. And that was going for a while, but she would book, or it was Elizabeth Garrow, she would book local bands sometimes to open up for some of the other bands. But I started to notice that it wasn't really well attended, and then no one really knows what's going on with Alibi. It's closed right now. I mean, I've heard rumors that it's going to reopen, and, I've tried to find out myself. But these local bands don't really have those opportunities anymore. The McCallum has the open call for classically trained singers or someone that has a more classical style of performing, but I'm just not noticing anything for kids that want to play rock music or, Danny Lux. It's like, where's he going to play?
After
where's
Coachella.
Where's the next Danny Lux going to perform? And the Coachella Valley to gain prominence and, sort of win over a local audience.
That's interesting you say that. I think one of the things that Bruce was was known for was bringing a lot of that culture into the in front of us, so that we could see some of the culture that was outside of Coachella or things that were kind of behind the scenes a little bit. Do you feel a little responsibility to kind of keep that going up in your writing?
Well, my focus is different, but when I left CV Independent, Matt King was my replacement. Matt King, Matt King is incredible because I've known him since he was a kid. I mean, it's not too long ago that he was just a kid. I mean, he just turned 21, but he's a local musician. He plays in bands, he was in this band, Frank Eats the Floor, and then he has this new band, Matt and the Kings, and he plays in a couple of other bands as a bass player. And I'm seeing him right in CV Independent flying that flag, supporting the local artists. And then he's putting out these record compilations with all these local bands on them. I'm proud of what he's doing. And, he's continuing that legacy. And, as much as Jimmy Bogle probably isn't going to be happy to hear it, CV Weekly keeps the local music scene alive too. And I think that's important. Because I always said, it's a good thing that CV Weekly exists, and it's a good thing CV Independent exists, because we're both doing the same thing. Yeah. We're promoting local bands. And we each have our different perspectives of them. We each have our different descriptions of them. We interview them differently, but either way, they're getting out there and they're getting known. So from a competition standpoint, it was kind of rough to compete with CV Weekly, but I respect what CV Weekly does, and I think the CV Independent and CV Weekly are the two best local publications for local bands, and I think both those publications do an excellent job.
How did the pandemic impact you as a writer at the Desert Sun?
It was hard because I had that 7 or 8 months where I got to be Bruce Fessier and have that Bruce Fessier experience. And, I was really looking forward to doing my first Coachella with the Desert Sun. I had Kristen Sharkey, who was my editor at the time, sat down with me. She's like, let's build a calendar for 2020. And we were slowly building it and getting all these ideas of where we wanted to go. And then
it turned out to be a 60-day calendar.
Right. Yeah. And what was hard for me was going right into that. I had a couple of articles that I got to finish that were entertainment related. And then when the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, we need to find stories that are related. And I'm writing about local musicians that I know. Well, I'm kind of depressed because I can't go play music, but, the money isn't an issue. Or I know a few that they're professional musicians locally that couldn't pay their rent. And those stories were heartbreaking. And then I did a story where it was about last rites, like how are the priests, rabbis, and pastors doing last rites.
Wow.
And those were difficult stories to write, but then when they all dried up, I became the guy that was tracking all the new cases, the deaths, and then I became a breaking news reporter for months. And breaking news, I'm still doing it now. I am not a car crash guy. I am not there's a fire in a field somewhere. Every time that happens on my watch, I'm just panicking and trying to get all the information I can, and it's still new to me.
We had Larry Bohannon, and just before he came in, he
covered a car crash.
He covered a car crash.
Car in the canal.
Yeah. He came in.
Car in the canal.
We all became breaking news reporters, and we still are breaking news reporters because our paper has changed since the pandemic. We all have to
all
pitch
the
in.
papers have changed since the pandemic,
But it was months before I wrote an entertainment-related story or something that wasn't a press release, and I felt depressed for a long time. Like, this is not what I imagined.
That was a tough time. We suspended production of Eye on the Desert at KESQ because there was nothing to promote.
Right.
There were no events. There were no concerts. There were no... So, and I think, there was no choice. And you had to focus on the news of the pandemic. But we then began to sort of wallow in the news of the pandemic because there wasn't any entertainment going on, no live entertainment. Right. And I think that was a really difficult time.
Yeah.
And particularly for people like you who make your living really delving into local culture when there's a dearth of local culture, there's nothing going on.
Yeah.
And then you have to focus your talents on talking about how many people died today from this pandemic. It was a very dark time for journalists. Period.
What was really dark was when they did give me that, every day I had to check the count, and, I would see the numbers go up, and then I'd see them come back down, and then the deaths would go up, but the numbers were dropping.
That had to kind of weigh on you after a while.
Yeah, because I was sitting there paying attention to trends, and I was, writing them down every day, more people dying, cases going down, cases going up, less people dying, but it would reverse. And then when you had to break it down by city, and it's this is just too much. And I think I went out for a week on a vacation, or because we were doing furlough weeks at the time. I came back and said, I can't do this anymore. It's when I remember telling Julie McKinnon, I think it was around the time of Easter. When Easter rolled around, Julie, I can't, this is just too much. And, I remember we had the heart-to-heart about, I'm not used to this. This is new to me. And she understood, but, a lot of us were dealing with it. And I started to feel for the other reporters because it's they're not used to this either.
Nobody had been through it.
And it's none of us know how to cover this. This is all a big surprise. Yeah. And, it weighed on all of us, too. And, I sort of took a little bit of an offense every day when I would turn on my social media and you'd see those memes, the media says this and, all these things. But, I kind of learned to tune that out. And it's I'm just still going to do my job and keep doing my thing.
That's a really interesting thing. And I think I had talked to Bruce at this about one point where all of a sudden you, just by the nature that you worked for the media, there were people that considered you an enemy.
Yeah.
How did you deal with that?
Well, I've kind of dealt with that for a long time. Even going back to when I first started. I've had critics in the local music scene, whether they're people that go to shows or, I sort of refer to them as the edgelords. And, you just kind of learn to let it go. And you're not going to convince anyone or, you just have to let it go. And
do you have thicker skin now than you used to?
Yeah.
Any of that have to do with your Buddhist background?
No. I abandoned my Buddhist background a long time ago. Wow. You dug deep, huh?
I dug very deep.
Yeah, the Buddhist background. I was a Theravadan Buddhist for a while, and then I just kind of abandoned Theravadan Buddhism and just read Buddhist books and meditated and did that for 10 years, but it got to be, I just phased out of that.
So how do you deal with it? How do you deal with the pressure of deadlines and being judged on the next thing that you do? How do you deal with that?
You just deal with things one at a time. Your deadlines and, I'm not saying that they don't exist, but you have to kind of work around and do everything that you can. But you have to take things one thing at a time. Because if you start to worry about the 4 other things, whatever you're working on at the moment is going to suffer. So you kind of have to take things one thing at a time. And I think that might irritate people that have worked with me, that I'm very one thing at a time minded. But it's the best way that I know how to do something. And then when I finish, I'm going to move on to that next thing, and I'm going to move on to the thing after that. I'm a very focused one thing at a time person.
Got it.
Multitasking is a skill that I have, but it only goes so far. And I think the human brain, when it comes to multitasking, is overwhelmed more and more every year that passes and the more culture shifts.
So the tunnel vision kind of keeps the outside noise away too.
Yeah. I'm not to the point where I can't multitask, but again, I notice things suffer if you just start to worry about everything else or you're trying to do multiple things at once. And, I've even heard from people that are expert multitaskers. I'm still not very good at it. And I'm like, well, I've seen what you can do when you multitask, and it's I'm still not very good at it. But maybe it's that self-criticism in your ear, but I definitely know for sure if I'm worrying about 5 things at once, one thing's going to suffer.
Have you gotten to the point of recognizing that you're pretty good at what you do?
Yeah. there's a difference between confidence in what you do and, sort of being egotistical about it.
Yeah.
I kind of just take the confidence that I know what I'm doing. I know that I do it well. And when I'm given the opportunity to focus on doing something and write a really good story, I always feel satisfied with it afterward when I read it. When I'm given time to actually seek out information in a story, talk to people, find a unique angle, read it a few times, and I love that. And when I see it go up and I read through it, I'm like, yes, this is what I love.
Do you still get any kind of a little thrill seeing your name on the byline there?
I think that kind of ended a long time ago. But for the first 5 years I worked in journalism, I always got a thrill of seeing, the paper, the finished product, the monthly CV Independent, and I would go through, and Jimmy would always be like, why are you reading that? You know what's in it. And I'm like, there's something about seeing my article in print and reading it that I love. And okay, he would just kind of nod at me. We would be sitting in the Ace Hotel, ahead of trivia night, and I'd just be reading through it, and he'd be like, I don't get what you're doing.
We're going to be, with the arena and some of the other things that we're doing in this city, this valley is going to continue growing and moving into an area. Where do you see it going entertainment, music-wise?
Well, I think it could grow. I think it could grow as far as the entertainment goes. Will we become an Austin, Texas? Will we become a New Orleans? Probably not. But I see this becoming a destination where there is live music involved, and not just a resort city, not just a golf city, but there's things to do. You can go to a concert. You can explore a little bit of a local music scene.
Do you think it'll add to a more full-time entertainment?
Yeah, I think it will. When I see the arena and what they got planned going through the summer, there's definitely going to be some entertainment offerings that are going to draw people here.
Patrick, I don't know what else to ask this gentleman. He's told us everything we need to know about Coachella and the desert sun.
Just enjoying you watching, drilling the hell out of the guy.
Yeah, I knew that this was going to be a very interesting interview for me, besides the fact that I'd heard a little bit about Brian and what his upbringing was in the entertainment and writing business. Very clearly, everything that you're writing about is something I have an immense amount of interest in. So I apologize I dominated the conversation here, but I was fascinated
okay. I was
by
napping.
this.
Was it great? No, I'm kidding.
How did I sound?
You sounded. I was listening to Brian.
Oh, good. So, Brian, what's next for you? You mentioned that you wrote poetry as a younger person. Are you writing anything else?
No.
Do you have any desire to?
No, and in fact, every time I tried to write some sort of like a literature or fiction literature, I'm not Todd Goldberg. I don't know how to write good dialogue between characters. I don't know how to do any of that.
Isn't it a little harder, though, especially when, you are on deadline. You have to write this stuff. You got to churn it out. There's, there is no stopping that machine. So then when you sit down to write for fun, it still feels like work.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's got to be a little bit of that.
By 5 o'clock sometimes, especially, I remember when the Power Trip announcement came out and having to jump into 2 or 3 articles about it. The tickets, the context of what this means, coming here, and, the initial announcement, calling people. By like 5 o'clock, my brain was pudding. People don't understand that your brain after a while just says no more. And when you sit down, it's like just watch television or read a novel of some kind.
Is that what you do when you need to shut down?
Yeah, I become very good in the mornings about doing a crossword puzzle just to get my brain going again. And I've been doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. And what I love about that, and I never used to do crossword puzzles, but I love connecting a clue with a word. And even though I'm not very good at thinking of it off the bat, I'm getting better at it just by pulling up my phone and looking like, well, I've never heard that phrase before. What does that mean? And then when I see the word, I'm like, oh. And I'm starting to notice I can connect certain words to certain phrases and certain meanings. And it's kind of a nice little brain teaser to get going.
Well, and as a writer, that's got to be an added skill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I start with the mini crossword, and then I move on to the full-size
Are
one.
you doing Wordle yet?
No.
Oh, good.
I
I've
don't
never
do
done
Wordle.
it.
I don't do anything like word searches or crossword puzzles that get me social media attention. I'm not into that.
Yeah.
What about Scrabble? Are you a Scrabble player?
You know, my mom and I used to play, and my mom was actually really good. I was really surprised.
We were
by
a
that.
Scrabble family growing up.
Yeah.
And it was our dad crushed us every time, but it was, you had to strive to beat him. So
Yeah. And I was never good with the letter Q, and I was never good with the letter Z.
Well, on that note of Scrabble, Brian, first of all, I hope we can have you on here again. I mean, this is one of those things where I already know that every couple of months there's going to be stuff we're going to want to be talking to you about, so I hope we can get you here again.
The special Power Trip episode.
Oh, that's going to be fantastic.
We need to do a deep dive on, but who else wants to do a deep dive on Power Trip is Mr. Skip Page.
That might be good to get these two in here together and talk about it. Skip can break some news that Brian can roll out into the desert
or
sun
we could
the
have
following
them just
day.
arm wrestle.
I like that.
That
too.
would be fun too.
Brian, thank you for being here today. This has been wonderful. Patrick, we did it again.
Yes.
Shocking.
Delighted to have you. It was really actually nice to actually sit back, listen, and get to know you a little bit better. I read your stuff a lot, but we operate in different but the same circles. So it's always good to see people from the print side of things.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I want to thank our engineer and producer, John McMullen, for helping us again. Patrick, I want to thank you for just agreeing to show up again for the Patrick and Randy podcast.
But, at bare minimum, I can show up. That's it. I do that best. My wife will tell you that.
Welcome
We want to also
again.
thank Skip Page for hosting us here at Little Bar.
The universe, center of the universe in the Coachella Valley, Little Bar in Palm Desert. Thanks for being here. Brian, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks for listening to Big Conversations Little Bar. Join Randy and Patrick next time as we keep the conversation going right here on Big Conversations Little Bar.